So, Doug, the first question I wanted to ask you with regards to cold calling is how it can help encourage students to think a bit harder and make them all accountable. So,
Yeah,
I thought it might be really interesting just to start. Your initial explanation, if you were going to describe cold calling in just one sentence, someone who hadn't heard it before, and also why you think it might help improve how hard students think and the role of accountability has in student learning.
sure. To your first question, I would define cold call as calling on students regardless of whether they raise their hands or whether they volunteer, which means that we can call on students who raise their hands. It's important to, but also students should feel like they also might be asked to participate if they haven't raised their hand. And I think that this is vitally important because, I sometimes refer to it as loving accountability or caring accountability because that's how I want teachers to think about it, which is we do this because we're trying to build an environment that causes students to be attentive and maximize their own learning. And when I talk about that with teachers, I always think about a study that I know that you know as well. It's Sedlov and Sadlacek's Czech study from 2024, I think, where they did something really fascinating. They tracked the academic progress of students in Czech schools, and they disaggregated the students based on their behaviors in the classroom and their self-reported motivation. And so one group that they had was what they called diligent students, who were highly motivated students who never spoke in class. And actually, there are a lot of these students in the Czech Republic. And another group of students was chatty students, which were students who spoke a lot in class. And interestingly, the chatty students were not always as internally motivated as the diligent students. They were kind of all over the map. But what they found was that the diligent students still lagged behind their more vocal peers in the classroom, which tells us that motivation, the desire to learn, is not enough if you're just sitting passively in the classroom, that students rely on us as teachers to build an environment that causes them to engage, that causes them to generate a version of the material that they're studying, to think actively and to talk actively about it. And when we do that for students, we know that we optimize their learning. And so that's why I tend to refer to it as loving accountability or caring accountability, because for the most part, very few people have the force of will to, on their own, maintain the optimal state of learning for long periods of time.
So I've always thought like it actually takes quite a lot of confidence for students to insert themselves into the
Sure.
conversation. Like, you're spotlighting yourself essentially. You're like, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense to stay as part of the group and
Yeah.
not separate yourself. Whereas that's what often is needed if you're gonna involve in conversation. And I imagine so cold calling is one way that we can help like manage that essentially is even if you don't have the confidence to insert yourself you're suggesting we can use it to draw you in to the conversation, right?
I think it's a great phrase to have in the back of your head if you're using cold calls, inviting students into the conversation, which
Yeah.
is like which tells them that also that they're important, right? That they're part of the classroom, that we need to hear your voice, that we're not complete without you. No one enjoys a classroom where it's the same two highly verbal students or adults
Yeah.
answering every question. One, it's just not that interesting. Two, the people who always talk are a psychological subset of the group.
Yeah.
Yes, thoughtful people are often very observant of the norm and they're asking, am I violating a norm when I offer to speak? And many people are often worried about whether they are valid to be speakers.
Yeah.
Maybe uh, English isn't their first language, or they're very shy, or they like to take their time to think, and so they need to be reminded that they're full members of the group in full standing and that their voice matters as well. And I think a beautiful cold call can do that. I think just a really simple way to do that is to say to a student, Bradley, can you get us started? Or Bradley, what are your thoughts on this? Right? Which says to you, I'm inviting you into the conversation. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's important that we hear from you, that you're a member of this group. And I think that oftentimes the teacher has to break the norm for the students.
Right. And I know because I've read in your work that you've been quite in the role of like group dynamics and like kind of
Mhm.
social psychology and the role it plays. And there's various psychological effects. Some people call it the bystander effect. Some researchers call it social loafing. Essentially, the
Yeah,
more people who are present, the less likely an individual is to do something, essentially.
yeah,
And I've always found this quite interesting with students, how they behave sometimes really differently one-on-one to how they
yeah.
have
So
in a
true.
group. And I'm guessing, and cold calling is, I guess, by knowing that I might be cold called upon, therefore I'm not relying on the rest of the group to kind of get me through, which is very easy to happen, right?
I think that's such a fascinating analogy. I'm so glad you said that. The phrase that I have often heard for this is diffusion of responsibility, which is if there are multiple people watching an event, people are less likely to step in and help. If there are 10 people standing around because they're like, oh, someone else will do it. If no one else is doing it, this person probably doesn't need help. And there are actually very tragic stories about that.
Yeah.
I think the version of this is like maybe rather than diffusion of responsibility, it's diffusion of accountability, which is that there are lots of people and no one has said, and I don't feel individually accountable. I'll just kind of defer and let someone else step in. And if no one else is stepping in, my read on it is like maybe it's not right to step in at all. And
Yeah.
so I do think that like I I was really struck by that analogy that you made. That I do think there's a very similar social phenomena in classrooms.
Yeah. And I guess the one thing I just wanted to push back on or challenge you, because I know I get
Yeah,
asked this question all the time. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. You use the phrase loving accountability.
yeah,
And this idea of like, we don't want this diffusion of responsibility. We do want students to be accountable for their learning. I've
yeah,
had a number of people tell me that they had really bad experiences on being cold called upon 20, 30, 40 years ago when they were at school. This
yeah.
idea that accountability actually means that I can call on you whenever I want. It might come across as embarrassing or I'm picking on you. And that kind of high accountability could easily morph into high levels of stress, for
Sure.
example, and high
I
levels of
mean,
embarrassment as
is
well.
it true that that teachers could potentially misuse the technique? Of course, right? It's a powerful tool. We have to be aware of the limitations. I think two things about that.
Yeah.
One is I think a really good first. I think teachers should be aware that cold call is not a gotcha. And I've tried to be explicit about this and teach
Yeah.
like a champion that my my goal in cold calling is to cause you to think, to cause you to engage, to cause you to learn more.
Yeah.
And if I notice that you are off task and checked out during the lesson, cold call is not the tool that I use to address that. If
Right.
I'm teaching and you're in the back room and you are giggling or your head is down on your desk, what I should do is walk over to you and say, Bradley, I need to see you sitting up. This is very important. Following along, we're on page 86, please. And even maybe, and I'm going to come to you in a minute to ask you a question. So be ready, right? Those things are reasonable. Bradley, what did I just say? Or Bradley, what was Kevin just talking about? Like that is not, that is a, that is a gotcha. And it's an attempt to use cold call as a disciplinary tool. And it is not that.
Yeah.
And so the second thing I would say is that a great phrase to have in the back of your head is that when you cold call a student, you want them to get it right. It doesn't
Right.
mean they always will get it right, and we should be prepared for what happens if we cold call a student and they don't get it right. But my goal is always for them to get it right, and if my goal is not for them to be successful, I should not use it.
Which is really interesting, just to pick up on that last point that you want them to get it right. I've always thought one of the most powerful parts of cold calling is the teacher has the responsibility of who to ask to answer the question, and they're choosing someone for a particular reason. Like we're
Hmm.
not talking about lollipop sticks where someone's chosen at random. Uh,
Yeah,
by cold calling someone, and I'm choosing to call on you, Doug, for a particular reason, part of that reason and that judgment call of why to call on you specifically is because I think you have a good chance of getting it right.
or because I need to know
Yeah.
if you know and understand, right? That if I only call on the students who volunteer to tell me, I will always get a skewed sample of my classroom, and I
Yeah.
will always be unaware of the gaps in the students who are not learning, and that's I think one of the most important things that teachers can do if they want to use cold calling, and I think that they should, um, is to do a rollout speech, which is a very short 30-second explanation for students. In this class, I will sometimes cold call you. That means I'll call on you whether or not your hand is raised.
Yeah.
And then I want to explain it. And I do that, and maybe I want to say to make sure that you're always locked in you're thinking, because this will help you learn. And then maybe I also want to say, and because it's my job to make sure that you understand the things that we're talking about. And the only way that I can do that is if it's normal and natural for me to call on any of you to see how you're doing. Know that when I cold call you, a lot of times I'm trying to check whether you understand. I want you to get it right, but it's also valuable to me if you don't know the answer, because then we can start to fix it. And I just think making that transparent to students is really good practice and really helpful, so they understand I'm doing this because it's my job, and I'm doing this because I care about you and I want you to be successful. And I think that also helps to address the potential feelings of strain that a student might feel if they're cold called and it doesn't go well.
Perfect. And just one final question, if I may. So going back to the earlier point of social dynamics, And it's
Yeah.
only that we don't want this diffusion of responsibility. We want everyone thinking hard. If I'm being really cynical as a student, I'm there going, I'm in a class of 30. Chances are I've only got a 3% chance that you're actually going to call on me. So I can still get away with not having to do much thinking most of the time, because
Mhm.
chances are most of the time you are going to cold call on someone else. So in
Yeah.
terms of using it in conjunction with other techniques,
Yeah.
like stop and jot, turn and talk, think, pair, share, would you often advise using it in conjunction with other techniques as well to help increase that? Or is it something that you'd still recommend can be used really powerfully in isolation by itself?
Yeah. Well, I would say both. I would say that most of the time when I cold call, it is a what I think the phrase that I use is a backstop. I don't know if that
Yeah, no, that
word is
translates. Yeah,
quite as legible
yeah.
to UK to teachers in the UK, but like in baseball, behind the behind home plate is a backstop, which stops all the stops all the balls from going in the wrong direction. And so I think of cold call as a backstop. Often I use it after a turn and talk or after and everybody writes, where I say, jot down your thoughts for 30 seconds or talk to a colleague for 30 seconds. What are the primary causes of, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Now everyone has done the thinking. And in some ways, I'm using the cold call there to be like, okay, this will help you be accountable for the thinking that you've done during this time when hopefully everyone is doing the
Yeah.
thinking. And maybe I can say, this is so interesting. I'd love to hear from, and I can select some students who are a little bit quieter. So I do think, most of the time when I cold call, I use it as a backstop to some other activity that universalizes the thinking. And I
Yeah.
think, because I think there's a really powerful synergy there. And I think the second thing about that is my rule is when I cold call students, I should have, except in one situation, I should almost always have given them the opportunity to prepare. Right? If I want people to be successful, I should let them prepare. It shouldn't be a surprise to them. Oftentimes people know the right answer, but if you surprise them with the question, they
Yeah. Yeah.
freeze.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I could, in addition to like turn and talk or everybody writes, I could say something like, I'll give you a few seconds to think about that, and then I'll ask some of you your opinion. One, two, three, four, five. So just combining it with wait time, I think is
Yeah.
fine. The one exception to that might be I could imagine situations in like right before a test when we're doing very fast retrieval practice. Right, guys, exam tomorrow on X. Let's just make sure we're pretty clear on some of our basics. I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly and, and like coming around quickly. Don't, if you don't get it right away, don't worry. That's just a sign that maybe you need to study up on this a little bit, I'm going to go pretty quickly here. So I want to just, in the rare times when I'm not deliberately giving lots of preparation time, I would want to have a clear rationale in my mind for it. It's
Yeah.
late stage retrieval practice where speed is relevant. Speed is not always relevant, and I would want to explain that to students. But I would say in 90% of cases, I'm always letting students do something to prepare in advance and to universalize the thinking, because I think you're right that while it can build accountability, some kids are going to be willing to play the odds, especially if, one of the things I think it's good to do also is to tell students, look, if I cold call you and you don't know the answer, that's okay. And you should say, I don't know, and then we can talk about what you do and we'll help you get there.
Yeah.
Are there students who might take advantage of that? Of course, who'd be like, I don't know. Like, okay, you've given me an out and I'm taking it. And
Yeah.
so, that's another thing that we should be prepared for, which is I should have a productive response for that. And I should know that like if I allow students to, some students might, so I want to do everything I can to universalize the thinking as much as possible.
Amazing. That I think is the perfect note to end on. Can I just say, on behalf of teachers everywhere, a big thank you because I generally think some of the techniques you talk about in Teach Like a Champion and especially Cold Core, I've seen it be transformational in schools. So thank you for your time
Oh
and thank you
gosh, thank
for
you.
all your work on the area.